Let me introduce our speaker for today. So, Professor Neil Boister completed his PhD at Nottingham, and it was published as Penal Aspects of the UN Drug Conventions by Kluver in 2001. He teaches mainly in criminal law and researches mainly in transnational criminal law. Recent publications in transnational criminal law include An Introduction to Transnational Criminal Law, which is the book we're going to discuss today, and a more recent book, which we will have to get for our collection, called Histories of Transnational Criminal Law. He is the author of Extradition Law in New Zealand and is currently engaged in writing a book on general principles of international extradition law. Thank you so much, Neil, for joining us. We know it's late in the evening for you. I will give the floor to you.
Oh, thank you very much, Giovanna, and thank you for inviting me. It is 9:30 at night, so please excuse me if I'm not entirely articulate. Instead of focusing on the book as a whole, I could talk about the book and what's in the book, which is in its second edition, published in 2018 by Oxford University Press. And the book was really an attempt to try to describe the whole area of transnational criminal law. But instead of doing that, I thought I would try to take you on a kind of conceptual journey, because people often ask me, what do I mean by transnational criminal law? Why? What is transnational criminal law as opposed to international criminal law? And that is a good question. And what I'm going to try to do is try to illustrate how the concept came about, and as a result, then lead into what the book covers, or books various people have written, not just myself, on transnational criminal law. So without further ado, let's start at the beginning. So I wrote this book. I was doing research on drug trafficking control for my PhD in the 90s. And I'd done that mainly because I was living in South Africa at the time, and we were coming out of it in the post-apartheid phase. And it was quite obvious to us that we had very little idea of the various treaties, international treaties, which we were now going to be obliged to implement in domestic law. And that is how I got into international drug trafficking law. And then that's become a whole different part of my career. Every so often I'd come across the phrase, the international crime of drug trafficking. And it always jarred. Every time I looked at it, I thought, well, mainly, and I mean written by lawyers. They would, or not always, but often by lawyers, and they would call it the international crime of drug trafficking. And I would think, well, what does that mean? Because it doesn't strike me as being an appropriate term. It has a criminological meaning in the sense that drug trafficking across borders is international. So it clearly has a criminological content, and you could think of it entirely in those terms. But does it have a legal meaning? And that is really what stirred me up to pursue some kind of alternative way of describing cross-border crimes, or the law about cross-border crimes. That's really where that gave me effectively the energy to pursue this, because I was convinced that this was not convinced. I was fairly convinced that this was the wrong way of describing it. So, transnational criminal law. I'm not going to say we'll get to how the term itself came about, but I'm suggesting that transnational criminal law is a solution to the problem of cross-border movement or conduct of criminals and competence over their extraterritorial actions, all of which is entirely familiar to you because it's your bread and butter. And I would suggest that it's a solution that appears to be collective, but in practice is mainly bilateral. So it's mainly between states. They sort out their problems. When it comes down to the actual crimes themselves, they sort them out between them or among them, those directly affected by those offences. And it's a solution, my third proposition is which involves what Professor Donadeu de Vabre, who's famous for having sat as a judge at Nuremberg, he called a kind of conflict of criminal laws. So you can think of transnational criminal law as, as a modern term for describing what he would have called a conflict of criminal laws, which is a conflicts of laws is not it's part of private international law. It doesn't apply to criminal law generally, but he saw it as applying because he saw jurisdictional conflicts as central to the problems that states face when they have to deal with cross-border movement of criminal goods and of criminals themselves. And the fourth proposition is that the solution, transnational criminal law, tries to harmonize domestic criminal law and procedural law to enable more effective bilateral action in the suppression of cross-border crime. So the goal is more effective bilateral action or unilateral action, but not necessarily the collective action of the international community against a particular criminal. So those are just four simple propositions about transnational criminal law. If you go back into the history of cooperation across borders, I've been doing a lot of history, so I'm going to bore you now. I've been doing a lot of history lately. The prehistory of this this kind of cooperation is actually quite extensive. There's been a lot of work done on it by the Max Planck Institute in Germany. The cooperation between states in pursuit of certain kinds of offenders was common in Europe prior to the 19th century, what we would have considered the starting point of cooperation against cross-border crime. In fact, back in the 18th and the 17th century, there was a fairly extensive jurisdictional cooperation against vagabonds, brigands, and traitors. Were slightly more controversial because traitors were always of interest to the sovereigns who were pursuing them. And there was a lot of unilateral action, but also a lot of cooperative action. And in those early phases, it's been argued, you can see the slow emergence of a kind of what I would call transnational criminal law. In moving forward slowly into the 19th century, you have the adoption of the first crime suppression conventions, things on slavery, slave trading. And I've singled out one I always single out, which is the 1884 Submarine Cables Convention, which contains provisions on criminalization, on jurisdiction and on enforcement of jurisdiction, cooperation between states, or to do with specific functional problem, which is damage to cables, undersea cables, which were becoming prominent in telegraph communications. And so you have the first of these multilateral conventions, which were really focusing on what would be a small problem of a quite local kind. And at the same time as that treaty activity, you have the emergence of a concept of international criminal law in theoretical thinking about criminal law. The famous German Franz von Liszt, in 1898, he came up with what we would consider a kind of omnibus concept, an all-describing concept of international criminal law, although he didn't use the term international criminal law. But his concept included extraterritorial jurisdiction, extradition, and certain crimes created by international agreements, or created as the result of international agreements. And so you have this kind of global concept of international criminal law emerging parallel to the adoption of these first crime suppression conventions. I use the term suppression because, in fact, that's not my term. It was really commonly used in the 19th century, and I'm trying to trace out who used it first. It's not a common term used today. People don't like the idea of suppression of crime because it sounds like suppression of political activity. But it was, in fact, people like Sir James Stephen used the term suppression, and it was in common parlance in the 19th century. And I've tended just to follow that since then. So we have the 19th century, the growth of multilateral activity, There's no overarching institutional framework like the UN or the League of Nations or anything like that, but you certainly have an enthusiasm for the subject. Then we have the League. I'm moving slowly forward to the post-First World War period into the 20th century. Pre-World War I, you have the various drug treaties, Shanghai Opium Convention and the Hague Convention on Drugs, etc. And then under the League, you have the institutionalization of steps against drug trafficking, the Opium Advisory Committee, etc., etc. This is all old hat to most of you. But you have also the emergence and the parallel emergence of the idea of international crimes and international criminal courts. So you have these two parallel, trends where you have this idea that there should be an international jurisdiction, which was the jurisdiction which was mooted for the trial of the Kaiser after the First World War at Versailles, but was never actually executed because the Dutch refused to give him up as a political offence, and on the basis of the political offence exception in extradition. And parallel to that, you've got and this is, I think, an interesting point, the growth in the idea of solidarity amongst states against crime. So we have various NGOs, what we would call NGOs today, working of scholars on criminal law, working trying to come up with more appropriate technical solutions to criminal law problems. And out of that, you have a number of organizations, but one of them, which I think was very interesting, is the International Bureau for the Unification of Criminal Law. And the sense that, out of a social solidarity, which encompassed the whole globe, one of the goals would be the unification of criminal law. And we would all have the same criminal laws. These were grand designs. As a unification was explored at some length, and it was seen as a step towards universalism. Various individuals, Rappaport, Saldana, were advocates of this unification. But at the same time, there was skepticism about this idea. What the unifiers, those who were pushing social solidarity, they saw activities at the treaty level as slowly merging with activities to try to create an international jurisdiction for the prosecution of international criminals. They saw it all merging into one criminal law. And there was skepticism about this single concept of international criminal law. De Vabra, who I mentioned earlier, he talked about the meta-private international criminal law, because he tried to keep it separate. He said, but that's not what international crime, as prosecuted later at Nuremberg, is about. It's about trying to resolve problems between different jurisdictions. That is the main concern of this other part of the criminal law. We see during this era the increasing sophistication of crime suppression conventions. The 1929 Counterfeiting Convention is the classic example of this. The 29 Convention contains so many of what of the modern of precursors of what went into the UN Convention on Transnational Organized Crime in terms of the basic concepts, but it was constructed to address specific problems, particularly the counterfeiting of French francs within Turkey, which the French alleged were which the Turkish government was party to, or at least knew about, and which were constantly devaluing the French franc. And so there had been these problems for a long time. The Americans had similar problems with the US dollar being counterfeited in South America, and so they have a specific problem of a specific activity, and the solution is the construction of a major treaty to try to harmonize, but not, I think, to go as far as those who pursued unification of criminal law. At the negotiation in 1929, you had two groups of states emerged, and they're familiar, utterly familiar to anyone who's been to one of these treaty negotiations. The minimalists and the maximalists. The maximalists want everything. They want as much harmony as possible. And the minimalists want just enough to make cooperation in respect of specific problems possible. And of course, it's the minimalists who win out. And they win out constantly over the course of the history of these sorts of activities, because that is where the real interests of states lie. They don't lie in what some would regard as a kind of utopian unification of criminal law based on solidarity, on international solidarity. So moving from the League into the post-Second World War period, slowly through almost much of the time, you have the prosecution of international crimes in the international military tribunals in the post-war period, both Nuremberg and then later at Tokyo. What was interesting to me is I did a lot of research on the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, and in the process of development, I was very interested in where the idea of the crime against peace came from. The idea that you could hold individuals responsible for aggression. And one of the leading authors, in fact, many scholars today suggest he is in fact the author of the concept of crime against peace, is Aaron Treinen, a Soviet criminologist and criminal lawyer. And he made a very clear distinction between what he regarded as international crimes, crimes that were an expression of the collective interest of humanity, and the prosecution of which was of individuals by international community as a whole, and these, what he just referred to as the other crimes. And he, the quote from one of his, from a statement he made in 1944, because of their juristic nature, he said, and because of their factual significance, conventions for certain common criminal offences appear to be one of the various forms of reciprocal support for criminal law by governments having in view a realistic combat against crime. So an idea of reciprocity. The reciprocal action of governments is not connected directly with the problem of international crimes. Perhaps I read too much Treinen. That's why I'm so skeptical when people say drug trafficking is an international crime. Is an international crime. From a legal sense, I'm with him. I don't think that it is an international crime, not in the strict sense of the word at all. And in the 1970s, so we're moving in my historical evolution slowly through time into the 70s and post-war period. Gerhard Müller, who's well known to some of you, who was the leader of the UN Criminal Justice Branch and a well-known criminologist in the United States. I think he was head of the American Society of Criminology. At the 5th UN Crime Congress in 1975, he floated the concept of transnational crime Natarajan has pointed out that this, in his view, was originally a criminological term. Right? So transnational crime is a criminological term, purely criminological term, to describe cross-border crime. But as she notes, it evolved into a legal term in its use by the UN Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice Branch, because it evolves into a term to describe crime that impacts on different legal jurisdictions. That's and it's that dual nature which I think out of which you can extract a notion of transnational criminal law. In the 1980s, we have the major new UN Crime Suppression Convention, the 88 Drug or Vienna Convention, UN Drug Trafficking Convention, which has is kind of a highly elaborated version of the 1929 Counterfeiting Convention, with all the usual terms, all the usual parts of it, but with a lot more in detail in terms of cooperation. At the same time, though, you have the regermination of the idea that there is one international criminal law of which international crimes and these other crimes are a part, right? There's the part of this. And what's interesting is that that is used because international criminal law in a narrow sense the idea of an individual being prosecuted for a crime, a war crime at Nuremberg, had fallen largely into abeyance since 1945, 46, 47, 48. Since then, there had been nothing. Right? It was the wilderness years for many international criminal lawyers, and they were scratching for as much support as they possibly could. And so they saw all this treaty making going on in respect of these cross-border crimes, and they stuck it all together to try to build a convincing package that there was such a thing as an international criminal law. But interestingly, so this is where you see the emergence of the term itself, transnational criminal law. It's first used, as far as I can tell, borrowing from Jessop's view of transnational law. So he suggested that there was such a thing as transnational law, which was all law involved between states across borders, not just international law, domestic and international law. It's an amalgamation of transnational law with the term criminal law. And so it involves all criminal law, not completely confined to a single national entity. And its first use, as far as I can tell, was by Albanese and Otto Lagodny in a conference at the Max Planck Institute in Freiburg in the early 1990s. It was published as the Principles and Procedures for a New Transnational Criminal Law. The reasons, in fact, if you read these, the many papers in this publication, you will find that the term transnational criminal law is not used that often. It's used in the title, but it's used most frequently, most bluntly, by a Kenyan judge whose name escapes me, actually, talking about what is effectively cooperation against cross-border crime, which is the way I would use it. So you have some academic interest being rekindled about cross-border crime and the law relating to cross-border crime. At that point, there's a lot of interest in criminology of cross-border crime, and there's a lot of controversy about transnational crime and whether there is such a thing. And the Americans were quite in favor of it, but British criminologists, as I remember, were not, and was quite skeptical of it. But I'm no criminologist, but just talking about lawyers, amongst lawyers and legal scholars, you just see the first flickering of interest in these other things. What is going on here with all this cooperation? What is it doing to our domestic criminal law? Because most of these people who are participants in this conference were domestic criminal lawyers, and they're beginning to see the impact of all these norms and thinking, gee, it is actually having quite a significant impact, and we're not really aware of this process. Then the other major event, which I single out in the 90s, is the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. So this is the revival of international criminal law in a narrow sense. It revives with in the early 90s with the Yugoslav and Rwandan Tribunal, and then it reaches its kind of apex in 98 with the agreement of the Rome Statute. And I recall that when Prime Minister A.N.R. Robinson, who was one of the advocates for the establishment of the court, the International Criminal Court, before the Rome Statute was finally agreed, he was in favor of doing so precisely to deal with problems of drug trafficking, because of the problems that Trinidad and Tobago had with drug trafficking, which had led to a coup in which he had been directly, injured, actually, during the course of a coup run by drug traffickers. And so there was a lot of pressure to try to produce some kind of international criminal law court, which would deal not only with the core international crimes, which individual penal responsibility was already well established, but those other crimes, as Trinan would have referred to them, those other crimes. And I think that Turkey, for example, was quite keen on the idea of terrorism being within the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. But oh no, no, that was not to be. And I remember going to a conference in the UK, I can't remember where it was, where this was argued at some length, and why these treaty crimes could not be within the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. And the line taken was that they were not customary international law, and they did not apply individual criminal jurisdiction, and there was no jurisdictional entity creating these crimes, and as a result, they could not be incorporated within the jurisdiction of the court, and that was that. And so some are really quite severe block of any move to do so, and that's where it stopped. And I think there was a strong lesson there of, where transnational criminal law and the core international criminal law divide. So in the 2000s, you see Sharif Basiuni, who's one of the authors of an omnibus concept, who likes the idea of a completely grand view of international criminal law with everything in it. He includes both crimes with an international element, which are the core international crimes, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide, and crimes with a transnational element, a crime which he says involves or affects more than one state in its planning, preparation, and commission, either through the diversity of nationality of its perpetrators or victims, or because the means employed transcend national boundaries. So that idea is translated in the early 2000s in the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, the definition in Article 3, Paragraph 2 of what is transnational. An offence is transnational in nature if it is committed in more than one state. Committed in one state, but a substantial part of its preparation, planning, direction, or control takes place in another state. Committed in one state, but involves an organized criminal group that engages in criminal activities in more than one state, or is committed in one state, but has substantial effects in another state. That is effectively a jurisdictional description of what is transnational criminal law. So it's totally of transnational crime law. Why crime, or what makes crime transnational is the crossing or the implication of more than one jurisdiction. So this leads me to, I'm stopping with my little tour through the conceptual history to where I am now, and myself and many of my colleagues who subscribe to this notion. The current definition of transnational criminal law is defined as the suppression by international law through domestic criminal law of criminal activities that have actual or potential transboundary effects, or thirdly, transboundary moral impact. I stuck that in there because you have jurisdictional impacts that are actual in the sense that illegal good or the person being smuggled or whatever the case moves into your jurisdiction or moves out, or whatever the case, money moves in or moves out, or it has potential. It may move in, but it's stopped before it gets to your border, or planned, or there's a lot of criminal activity which may spill over into your jurisdiction, etc., etc. But I think also what has motivated a lot of treaty making, particularly in respect of crime, is just a transboundary moral interest. People, NGOs particularly, get highly active or have become very active, not just recently, but in fact over the last 150 years, and highly exercised about the immorality of what is going on in other states. And as a result, they've pushed hard for treaty activity in regard to drugs, prostitution, etc. It's smuggling of people, etc., etc. So you cannot underestimate the moral interest from one state into another. These features of the current definition are firstly that there are horizontal obligations on states. These obligations, I think, I initially thought of mainly in terms of treaties, but it's been pointed out it could be Security Council resolutions. It could be soft law. In fact, the Financial Action Task Force is in many ways the hardest of soft law, the recommendations it makes. But there are obligations on states, right? With vertical obligations on individuals in the form of criminal laws, procedures, criminal procedures, administrative laws for the asset forfeiture, etc., etc. So it has this kind of transversal nature, a horizontal relationship, where there's a breach, it would be a kind of international delict or tort. It's not a crime, and a vertical criminal law, or something of a quasi-penal nature. If you take apart a crime suppression convention, and that's what I've done in the book, in respect of a range of different crimes, is you end up with a whole lot of substantive measures. And the front part of the book, of my 2018 book, is all about the crimes themselves. The substantive measures are all about criminalization using the indirect method of international obligations and through hard or soft law. What is interesting, though, is that these crimes are all dealt with individually. They're in effect like an exercise of alteration, if you think in strict criminal law terms, of alteration of the special part of criminal law. And I remember having a conversation with Rob Cryer, Professor Rob Cryer, sadly passed away, where he said the one thing that distinguishes these offences from core international crimes is there is no general part to transnational criminal law. There is no general part in the sense that there are no general principles of what is intention, what is causation, what is an omission, etc., etc. What are the principles of liability of a perpetrator as opposed to an accessory? All those questions are left to the domestic criminal law of the states that are actually participating within this regime. So there is no general part, whereas by contrast, if you just look at the Rome Statute and its development in case law, and even Yugoslav, Rwanda, Sierra Leone, the special panels, etc., there's been so much activity about the changing nature of the general part. We have all sorts of different principles, indirect perpetration being borrowed from domestic criminal law and being sucked up, joint criminal enterprise being sucked up into international criminal law in a strict sense. That just doesn't exist in a meaningful way in transnational criminal law. So I'd say that there's one really, if you really like doctrinal distinctions, that's one of them. As far as procedural measures are concerned, you have indirect regulation of police cooperation, information exchange, mutual legal assistance. I don't need to tell you this, you know this already. Asset retrieval, extradition being the ultimate goal through hard and soft law. But I remember Bill Gilmore, Professor William Gilmore, pointed out to me, he said the real action, the real activity is a bilateral activity or regional activity where this stuff actually is made to work in respect of actual criminals. And as a result, the whole system of transnational criminal law, in my submission, is the goal is not some kind of utopian solidarity-driven harmonious criminal law. That is not the goal. The goal is a functional equivalence of domestic laws to enable cooperation, just enough equivalence to keep it operating. That would be my proposition. Just a word on the transnational element itself. If you look in these crimes, if you look at the constituent elements of these crimes, the essential elements of the crimes, most of these offences, if we call them that, they're not offences, they're treaty obligations or obligations inside a Security Council resolution or with some recommendation. Most of the offences are not described with a transnational element for the very reason that a lot of the activity is prosecuted domestically and doesn't necessarily have a cross-border element. There are occasional offences that do, like importing and exporting drugs, etc., but in most cases they don't, right? Transnationality is mostly through the expansion of jurisdiction. It's described in the law mostly through the expansion of jurisdiction, and it's an expansion of territorial jurisdiction towards continental notions of ubiquity, the idea that wherever it happens in some state's territory, if you break it up into its various actions, you can always find a territory that will have the necessary prescriptive jurisdiction. And then the extension of extraterritorial jurisdiction over nationals, passive personality, the protective jurisdiction have become much more important, even over crimes where where there's no possibility, they're only attempts, where they're inchoate, there's no possibility of them having any actual impact. You have these extensions of extraterritorial jurisdiction. What the treaty obligations do is they provide a permission to establish those forms of jurisdiction to states. Many states don't, but some do. I think I'm doing okay. Collective versus reciprocal interests are just a fairly abstract academic point. If you want to distinguish between international criminal law and transnational criminal law as parts of all criminal law involving, of all international laws involving crime, international criminal law can be said to be a collective action by the international community, and it's at least arguable that those crimes are obligations erga omnes or erga omnes parties amongst for example, all the parties to the Genocide Convention. There is a general obligation, and no particular state can contract out of them because it's owed to the international community as a whole. But in terms of transnational criminal law, it's different in my view, and because it's regulating transnational relations between states, and the obligations are to the other states affected by specific crimes in specific instances. That's something I think they are reciprocal interests rather than collective interests in the main, not always, but in general, I would argue. Has there been resistance to this notion of transnational criminal law? Yes, I can say there has. Amongst core international criminal lawyers, they say, well, why are you bothering with all of this? But apart from that, the initial reaction was, what? The one quite strong criticism is that this form of analysis is all top-down. It's looking at the way the system is actually impacting from how it's constructed down to the actual individual, whereas it should be looking at the condition of the individual upwards from a bottom-up analysis point of view. This is my colleague Sabine Kless, who's made this argument, and she said we should be focusing on the human rights predicaments of those individuals caught up in the system, which we haven't actually done so successfully, not very successfully. And I think that criticism has been sustained. So there's a lot of activity around the human rights implications of many of these cross-border criminal offences. There are also doctrinal objections to any claim that there's a system of transnational criminal law. And the basic objection is that if you've got a whole lot of systems of criminal law, which are regulated by treaties or resolutions or whatever the case at a horizontal level, there is no originating norm. It goes back to Kelsen and the idea of a Grundnorm. There is no originating norm out of which will be cascading norms. So you cannot say there's anything unifying the system, and therefore you cannot call it a system. It's similar to the objections made about the legal nature of international law as a whole. Yeah, I mean, you can get buried in those debates. Much more common, though, is the sociological objection. They don't like the idea of using criminal law, like transnational criminal law. They like the idea of transnational, but they don't like criminal law because they don't think criminal law, from a socio-legal point of view, is an adequate description of all the activity, administrative, civil, etc., that goes on. And quite current at the moment is the idea of transnational legal ordering, where effectively you can create an order in amongst some states, for example, around money laundering, and then you manage to replicate that order globally around the world, and you have all these little doppelgangers emerging of money laundering orders through something like the Financial Action Task Force. So you have different ordering. But my response to that would be that the criminal laws and the treaties play an important structural role in such ordering. They may not be the last word, but they are quite an important word in that process. Acceptance. Coming to the end of my talk, there has been practical acceptance. I've come across lawyers today saying, I have a department of transnational criminal law, I couldn't believe it. But it makes sense to lawyers, right? Because they don't prosecute. war crimes are crimes against humanity, but they do a lot of drugs work, and they break their work up in that way. It makes sense to them, and so it's a quite a convenient term. There's a lot of teaching of transnational criminal law going on across the world. I've been asked to go to a conference next year and talk about how to teach it, and there's a lot of research done into transnational criminal law by young researchers who've embraced this idea across the globe. And then finally, there's the generation of literature. There's, for example, an introduction to transnational criminal law, but it's not the only book on transnational criminal law, not by any means. It sets out effectively what I've said tonight, substantive crimes, and then all the enforcement of those crimes through the various modes of enforcement. And it has a theoretical discussion at the beginning, and then it draws out some of the weaknesses of the system. And then finally, my final point would be also to make a brief plug for the Transnational Criminal Law Review, which is an open access journal which has been established at the beginning of this year and which is entirely dedicated, and I'm on the editorial little committee, to popularizing the study and the exchange of information about transnational criminal law, because I've always felt that particularly in Europe and North America, there's a certain amount of navel gazing goes on, where if it doesn't make sense in North American and European terms, it doesn't make sense at all. And not being from those areas, and having grown up in Africa, I've been much more interested to see what goes on in the rest of the world. Well, thank you. Have you got any questions? I think I'll end my slideshow, and I will.
So we have 2 comments in the chat, which I will read out, and then we'll give the floor to Rika, who has a question. So thank you so much, first of all. It was really fascinating. And conceptually, of course, it is very challenging to have those distinctions between how we frame transnational versus international. And no, very, very interesting. So let me read out Demos's comments, and then we'll give the floor to Rika and then to Demos. So Demos's first comment had to do with the term suppression. So he says the term suppression and whether to use it nowadays has to be carefully considered, particularly in light of human rights considerations. And I think you touched on that a little. It is a term that does not necessarily reflect all objectives of crime-related multilateral instruments. So that's his first comment. And the second comment he had is, I have my own concerns about the doctrinal objections. Pretty similarly, arguments were raised in the past when discussing whether international criminal law was part of international or criminal law, thus departing from the essence, namely the autonomy of a new system of law combining elements from both international and criminal law. So I don't know if you want to speak to those comments before I give Rika the floor to actually ask a question.
Well, I think, first of all, to say that I think Demos has got a very good point relating to suppression conventions. I tend to get locked into the historical usage of something, and then I can't get out of it. So, it needs to be thought about quite carefully whether we still want to use the term suppression. I suppose it appeals to me because there is a kind of basic technical thrust about the combating of crime, which is still present in a lot of the language. But I accept, I mean, he's got a point. There's a lot more to it than just, there's a lot more about, the rights of victims, et cetera, et cetera. So to find the balance in those treaties it's not completely aptly described by the term suppression. No, I'll give him that. As far as the doctrinal objections are concerned, I'm with him. I agree. Yep.
Great, thank you. Rika, you have the floor.
Thank you. So this is a little bit kind of a selfish question as well, because I often get it. So I'm curious to hear your views. What do you think are the weaknesses of this this framework that we currently have, the UNTOC as such, and how, if you had kind of free hands, how would you change it? What would you change in there? What would you add? What would you delete? Anything like that? It's a broad question, so like feel free to focus on whatever comes to mind first.
It's interesting that UNTOC is always considered, it's like the jewel in the crown of the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, right? In a sense, because it was supposed to be the unifying convention, the convention I remember speaking to an Australian who was at the negotiations who said this was going to be the first and last convention, like the big one, where we will solve all problems. And I think that that's struck me quite strongly over the years, is that it should be able to solve many of the problems. There should be no reversion. In effect, you have a constitutional instrument, if you like. Well, no, it's not really constitutional, but at least a central instrument in which you should be able to plug a whole lot of new protocols as new threats emerge. And then you have all the procedural. It's a really quite simple model and quite simple to understand. And yet there is this reluctance to use it. And that is something I don't fully understand. You know, I had a conversation with a delegate from a state I won't mention, who pointed out that a lot of his domestic constituency felt quite threatened by the extent and the elaboration of the design of the offences in Article 5, for example, because they made it so easy, if translated into domestic law, to in fact take action against individuals who were vulnerable, and so they felt quite they would either sign up and not implement. This was straight out the horse's mouth, right? Or they would not sign up, and that would be where they stood. And I understood that. They feel threatened by it, because an organised criminal group, we have Section 98A in the Crimes Act in New Zealand. It's a very simple offence to set up once you understand the mechanics of it. One of the other points I would make about UNTOC is that, you know, it is not the only. It could be made into the central treaty with all the other offences as a kind of wheel plugged into it, but then there was the Corruption Convention, which was produced afterwards, and that has kind of slightly diverted attention. In effect, you've got this almost separate regime emerging, and the international society feels quite good at doing that. You have the drugs, you know, as a separate regime, and then the organised crime as a separate regime, and then corruption as a separate regime. That doesn't strike me as being entirely rational, although because it happens historically, it's quite hard to undo it and say, okay, we're going to, you know, to actually go back to the beginning and say, no, we're going to just push one system out, one set of rules. Every state will subscribe to them, and you're back with the idea of some kind of harmonization of, you know, some kind of unification of criminal law. Which is not a bad idea in theory, but it proved impossible in practice back in the 1920s. And it's just as impossible now as it was then. Yeah. Any other questions?
Yes, I believe Demos would like the floor. Go ahead, Demos.
Thank you very much, Giovanna. Thank you very much, Neil, for the very interesting presentation and for your responses to our questions. It is indeed an excellent book with very good analysis on different aspects of transnational criminal law. The reason that I raised this issue regarding suppression is that I think that one of the elements that we have to see in future will be also to analyze the interaction and the dialogue between, on the one hand, the set of principles of transnational criminal law, namely multilateral instruments of criminal law, substantive and procedural, of substantive and procedural nature, on the one hand, and on the other hand, distinct sets of rules on human rights considerations. For example, we have developed, for example, an issue paper recently on the UNTOC and its relationship with international human rights law. So I think that in future, this will be an additional element to analyze as an interaction between different rules of international law. Not only the interplay between multilateral instruments of criminal law nature and domestic criminal laws, but also horizontally sets of international law focusing on crime aspects and human rights aspects. That was the reason that I raised this issue. But also on the issue of the definition of transnational criminal law and whether this has been considered gradually from a criminologic term to a legal term. My humble view is that it might be better not to consider transnational criminal law as a legal term of art, but rather as a corpus of a set of provisions of both substantive and procedural nature. Procedural nature, for example, dealing with the provisions of international cooperation on criminal matters, extradition, mutual legal assistance, and so on. This has been evident recently, both in terms of research that we have developed. For example, the 2013 draft study on cybercrime does not define cybercrime, but it describes it as a set of contacts relating to cybercrime, so different categories of criminal acts. The UNCAC does not define corruption, but instead has substantive criminalization provisions on different contacts relating to corruption. The UNTOC does not define organized crime, but only the actor, the organized criminal group. Hence, I think that it might be very complicated for the scientific community, but also for the practitioners, to engage in a dialogue on the definition of the legal term. It might be better from a procedural and methodological point of view to consider this as a set of provisions, which of course forms a special category of international criminal law, lato sensu, different from the core international criminal law. And I have only one question for you regarding an issue that I had read in the book in one of the first pages regarding the legitimacy. And if I may, you reflect in the book some concerns and arguments of scholars, legal scholars, that transnational criminal law can be criticized from the perspective of normative legitimacy because of limited participation, transparency, and accountability in its development and implementation. Could you please further elaborate on this for us to fully understand the issue? Because in my understanding, the negotiation of international instruments, and most importantly, the implementation in the national legal order through the domestication of the criminal provisions implies this kind of legitimacy, since depending, of course, on the legal system involved, monist or dualist system, national authorities are involved in actually incorporating in authorizing the incorporation of these rules and standards and norms in the domestic legal order. Thank you very much. And again, congratulations. And my last remark is that the first edition was in 2012. The second edition was in 2018. Now we have further developments. We are looking forward to the third edition. Thank you.
Yes, yeah, the third edition, Demos, is like a mountain to climb, right? You could split it into two books. But yeah, I mean, I think you've made a good point about legitimacy. In fact, I haven't spent a lot of time working on this, but others have. And the basic argument is effectively that the construction of rules in a technocratic environment where where technical experts take over the process and effectively provide a whole lot of input, which is then filtered back into the domestic arena as a fait accompli, as though it's been done already and you simply have to accept it the way it is because that's the way everyone else wants it. And there is some tension at a domestic level. I remember when I arrived here in New Zealand, now this doesn't involve the UN, but the example related to the Financial Action Task Force recommendations, and they were presented. There was specific provisions here relating to insurance. So this is Chatham House rules, but insurance and money laundering. And it was presented as though, well, you're out of line, you need to get yourselves into line. And there was no option. You just get yourselves into line, and that was that. There was no input into the system. It was presented as an objective set of norms, and you had to become a part of it. And it doesn't go down well with local officials, particularly not in the Foreign Affairs, but in the Department of Justice. So when you get justice officials, they think, oh my God, what is this, right? They don't go to a lot of these conferences. They're not there when they actually happen. And so but others have much more sophisticated argument relating to legitimacy than that. My only goal really in transnational criminal law, if I had a simple goal, then this is how I would finish, is to try to get people to focus their attention on this field or system or whatever you choose to call it. And, you know, I hope I've succeeded in some small way, because it was neglected when I was a student. Any other questions?
Thank you very much, Neil.
There's one more question in the chat, so I'll read it out to you. Dear Neil, thank you so much for your talk on this topic. You talked about the difference between international and transnational crimes. I was wondering how sustainable you think this distinction is in light of the factual linkages between organized crime and core crimes, for example, in Latin America. Do you believe that the ICC should consider including some organized crimes in their jurisdiction if they are serious enough, also in light of the weakness of organized crime treaties in relation to enforcement? Or would you propose another enforcement mechanism?
That's a great question. I've thought about this quite a lot. I think if the international community managed to agree to include an organized crime offense within the Rome Statute through some kind of update or reform of the Rome Statute, then in effect it would have taken organized crime and transformed it into an international crime, because it would have established an international jurisdiction in which organized crime had become was the focus of the collective will of humanity, if you like, through acting through states, establishing individual criminal liability for that particular activity, participation in organized crime in some way, so that you would have transformed it completely. And that's which suggests that what you're really talking about is a kind of formal distinction. Whether that would be a good idea, yeah, that's a question of policy. Because there is a lot of terrorist organizations undertake, commit international crimes, and terrorism is arguably an international crime already. There's an ambiguity. I'm prepared to accept that. They trade in drugs in order to finance war crimes, blah blah blah. It's become quite common, and those linkages exist. But what is different is the jurisdictions are different, and that's where the distinction is sustained. And the legal system are split in some way at the moment.
Thank you for that, Neil. Are there any other questions? It appears not. Thank you so much, Neil, for taking the time to be with us, for you this evening, for us this morning. No, it was a very, very interesting talk, and a lot of, a lot to think about in terms of, reframing or rethinking how we understand these concepts. We do have the book in both ebook format and in print. So if colleagues are interested, feel free to reach out to the library. As I said, we're excited to look into acquiring your book from 2021. So
I have a copy just here.
Great. Yes.
Well, thank you. Thanks for inviting me. I was really happy to talk about it, and I'm always willing to. If you want to email me and ask me further questions, it's neil.boister@canterbury.ac.nz. I'm quite happy to engage in a conversation about it.
Wonderful. Thank you. Colleagues, thank you also for taking the time to join us this morning or this afternoon or wherever you might be in your time zone. We will then close our session for today. Thank you again.
Thanks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Neil.
Cheers, Rika.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Daniel.
Bye. Yes.